This is Burst Radio, Bristol University's radio station.
Joining me today is Dan Burkitt, who wrote a very interesting comment article about being an environmentalist means not taking recreational drugs. Give me an outline of what you said in your article.
Well, it actually started from conducting a survey, which was also in the Epigram week, that was basically trying to assess the extent to which students care about environmentalism, if they do anything for the environment. And what kind of came out of that survey was that people, the vast majority of people, it was like 90% of people, feel like they want to do more for the environment, and a lot of them are willing to sort of do things for the environment, change their habits. But the thing that was really telling was that there was a question about whether you would be willing to sacrifice kind of enjoyment or pleasure for the sake of the environment, and that was an overwhelmingly less kind of enthusiastic response, shall we say. So I think it was, I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but it was quite a small portion of people were. So I was thinking, what's a kind of interesting way to try and frame this argument, because, you know, it's quite hard to just encourage people to give up something like, say, going on holiday, and just thinking about what you can do to kind of be a better environmentalist, kind of air quotes. And I thought that the way that drug taking is kind of normalised at the University of Bristol was something to maybe think about, because I think it is something people forget, and that's the point that I was making in the article, that I think because I think when people take recreational drugs, the thought process is, this is going to harm me as an individual, because, you know, it could harm my physical health, my mental health. There's the possibility that I will get arrested for doing this, and it's like, once you hurdle those barriers to do with yourself, you kind of forget the wider implications of, oh yeah, actually in the process of, it's more about it's the consumption of the drugs that all the thought process is going into. It's not the production, and that gets forgotten. And so I think it's important to remind people that there is an environmental impact to the production of these drugs, particularly Class A drugs.
So what is the link between, so people see the stuff that they take in clubs or whatever, and they don't necessarily see what's gone into that production. So where do the majority of drugs you can buy in a night out in Bristol, where do they come from?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about cocaine, that is predominantly Latin America, and it's a massive cause of deforestation, particularly in Colombia, where it's often kind of like paramilitary groups as well, knock down huge parts of the Amazon rainforest in order to plant coca leaves. And there is some positive government intervention, I think, particularly in Bolivia, which is sort of like almost a stereotypical place kind of thought of for cocaine growth or whatever, coca plant consumption, where they do try and encourage people to grow other crops and whatever. But that was sort of, I don't know, maybe one of the frustrating things when you write an article like this was that there was one person commenting like, oh yeah, you know, it's all well and good telling people not to take drugs, but really we need government intervention. And you kind of want to say, well, yeah, but the Bolivian government aren't going to read Epigram, are they? So this is just, I felt like this was something you can actually like try and influence people a bit. And I think if it makes people think twice about taking drugs next time they would, then that's probably a positive thing. So
you talked about how people would be willing to sacrifice personal pleasure in order to the environment. Do you think it's sort of a thing about human nature that we don't want to sacrifice personal pleasure? Sort of, we'll be environmentalist if it doesn't affect me too much. Yeah. Well, I think it's a question of habit, really. I think we're all very used to this certain kind of lifestyle that doesn't really take into account kind of environmentalism. And I think humans are just creatures of habit, and I think if we break the habits that are negatively impacting the planet and instill some new ones, for example, like this is a set point to drugs, you know, like plastic packaging, everything being in plastic packaging, that hasn't always been the case, doesn't need to be the case. You're starting to see the introduction of plastic-free supermarkets. I think it was in the Netherlands last week. I don't know if you guys saw that too. Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's just sort of how are we as a society going to get out of this kind of rut of thinking that the way that we behave is acceptable.
Do you think one of the problems of sort of endemic drug use is that people take them because they're easily available? Do you think if the police cracked down a bit more, or if there was more government intervention as someone suggested, then there would be a way of it would sort of fix the problem of drugs being an environmental problem by not making them as readily available on the market?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, because I do take the point that people are going to be able to get drugs. Like it's never going to be hard to get drugs. And I think particularly with the advent of the deep web as well, like it's easier than ever to just order drugs online. You can get drugs so easily. So I think it is probably naive to, well, that's the whole war on drugs, you know, going after supply lines is, I don't know, maybe not the best way to go about it. I think trying to change people's attitudes is maybe a better idea, particularly because I think a lot of people forget about the kind of humanitarian environmental impact, because it's just, you're thinking about yourself as the user as opposed to production or any of the other aspects that go into it.
Yeah, so a lot of talk has been going on about sort of the decriminalisation of drugs, and particularly students seem to be quite keen on the idea. Where would you stand from an environmental perspective on the decriminalisation of drugs?
Well, this is probably where I get a bit muddled, because I actually would be in favour of decriminalising possession of drugs. I don't think people, drug users should be kind of demonised for drug use. And this is kind of a separate issue, because what I'm talking about with like kind of cocaine and MDMA, that's more like designer party drugs that are basically just kind of posh students deciding that they want to have a good time, and that's like what they'll do, and they won't really think about it. I think when you come to the question about decriminalising possession of drugs, that's often to do with people who are really, you know, disadvantaged in society, who end up kind of addicted to heroin or things like this. I think, like, when have you ever heard of a Bristol student being arrested for possession of drugs? Like, it just doesn't happen. I think it's a class issue ultimately, and so I would be in favour of decriminalisation of possession of drugs. I think reminding people of the ethical consequences of drug taking and ensuring that they then make a personal decision not to take drugs is the best way to do it. Not to kind of brutalise them for taking drugs.
So do you think there's a way sort of forward to getting this message out? So obviously you wrote the article for Epigram. Is there is like a movement or a campaign that students can get involved in?
There's no movement or campaign that I can think of. You know, it tends to be quite a kind of getting a slap on the wrist being told in school kind of thing, isn't it? So it's not really something that is a big movement. But I mean, I hope maybe this article will be the start of something. It's hard to say. I don't know. If next time you're in a club and you see people who look a bit more sober, then maybe that'll be the answer.
It's certainly an argument I've not heard before, which is silly though, because you think about the environmental sort of detractions of Class A drugs and how they're manufactured, and the whole sort of, there's no, as you said in your article, there's no such thing as a fair trade drug. Everything is sort of fundamentally, from an ethical perspective as well. Do you think that students are culpable in the sort of, especially for Class A cocaine and stuff, to look out for the human lives that may have been lost in the creation of that drug?
I think you have to consider yourself culpable. I mean, if you're not, then who is? Because, you know, supply feeds demand. If there's no demand, then there's going to be no supply. So I think you as a consumer have to consider yourself culpable. And the other point that I raised in the article is that I think most people are very much prepared to see themselves as culpable as a consumer in a lot of other aspects of kind of more kind of like normal, quotes, like conventional consumption, such as you know, like not buying sweatshop made clothes, or, you know, not buying meat for the sake of, you know, because you've seen Cowspiracy, whatever. So I think you have to consider yourself culpable.
We've talked about cocaine, but are there any sort of, so someone will go, I just smoke some weed every now and again. Like, how am I possibly like causing environmental detriment? Are there any things that are worse than others?
Definitely. So like cocaine is by far the worst. I didn't look into heroin because I assumed that wouldn't really be on the radar for most people at University of Bristol. And then like weed and hash weren't as bad, but obviously there's still some environmental impact. That one is sort of more difficult because it is, well, weed is actually one that you could really advocate being consumed in a really sustainable way, because you can literally grow the plants yourself in your back garden. So I think that is one that you could kind of hold up as like an interesting case study for, we can do this right. But obviously, you know, the other thing that's difficult about that is you kind of put drugs under all this one banner, the reason that people are smoking weed and the reason that they're taking cocaine are completely different. Like they're not in the same ballpark.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're two different cases.
Cool.
But yeah.
Dan, thanks very much. That was very interesting.
Yeah,
it's 9:25 and this is the Epigram Show.
This is Burst Radio.
Bristol University's radio station.